Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome tonight. It's so good to be back in Kansas, and good to be back here at the Rime Center. Which I had such a good time at last year, and I recognized some of you from last year, so it was really good to see you all again. Is anyone here for the first time who's new to the Rime Center? Has everyone been here? Great. So I don't have to offer a welcome. So great. So I am Lama Rod, and um, I don't know where I'm coming from. Actually, I'm still in another time zone. But um, regardless, it's always such an honor to be sitting and talking Dharma, talking practice, which I think is so important right now. Is for us to be talking about Dharma and practice, but to also be talking about Dharma and practice in a way that is relevant and contemporary and connected to what we're experiencing right now as individuals, as a community, as a country, as a world. I feel that if our Dharma practice isn't being connected to what we're experiencing in the world as it is, then the risk is that we lose connection to the practice. Our practice should always be fresh, innovative, adaptive, appropriate for us and how we're manifesting in the world. It should be interesting, and it should be hard and uncomfortable. So all of that at the same time. If you're really comfortable practicing Dharma, then you're doing something wrong. You should not feel so good moving in the world, practicing compassion. It shouldn't be like something that you're really excited about. You shouldn't be really excited about trying to have a compassionate conversation with someone who is a nationalist. For instance, since that is now a part of our reality again, nationalism. And fascism. So this is our world now, and our Dharma has to meet that reality. Then you can say, "Oh, this is a dream. Everything is in the ultimate." That's great, and if you're stuck in that view, then you're going to get really pissed off with me, because I'm not. I don't have the luxury to sit in the ultimate view because I have to sit in the relative and walk out in the world, And when people see me, they don't see, "Oh, you're just nothing but the integration of emptiness and luminosity." You're just a reflection of my own mind, Imaho. If only. If only I could truthfully also offer that to people around me. "Oh, you're really racist and transphobic and classist and all of that, but you're just emptiness manifesting as sound and appearance." It just doesn't quite work out on the spot. So I have to practice a little more, as well as we all have to practice a little more with the relative. The ultimate isn't something that we parrot or perform or act out. It's something that we earn through the messiness and the metabolizing of the relative. So you have to go through the shit to get to the lotus. As my friends in London say, no shit, no lotus. It's not the other way around. It's no lotus, no shit. But yet you start with the shit, the chaos, the confusion, the ignorance. You start with samsara. Samsara is so beautiful like that. All this ignorance, this delusion, this ambiguity is so beautiful because it is the foundation, it is the ground from which we will obtain realization. We have to start somewhere. And when we start in samsara, when we start in the mess and in the chaos, then we appreciate the journey into clarity much more. I often think about the Matrix. And it's so interesting how relevant that movie becomes year after year. If you haven't, who's not seen The Matrix? Go and see The Matrix. Are you a Buddhist? Do you do the Buddhism? Yeah, it's really actually quite a dharmic movie. It's a quite depressing movie. And it realistically reflects the disappointment that you will experience early in your Dharma practice. When you begin to watch your own mind, you begin to wake up and you're like, oh shit, this is like really stupid and messy. Can I go back to sleep? Can I not do this Dharma thing again? Because I thought I was happy. I just wanted to have a little more fun, so that's why I started meditating, because everyone else is doing it. Everyone else is like mindfully doing whatever. I didn't want to be left out. But with the Matrix, it's like, oh, we think we're starting somewhere, and then you start practicing, you're like, oh, I'm actually further behind than I realized. You wake up to the real world of your mind, of your habitual patterns, and you're like, oh, wow. And I always relate that to social issues. I always think about privilege and power, because everyone's like, sometimes we have all this privilege and we're like, oh, life is so good, and then you start practicing and bringing awareness to the reality of social conditions, and you're like, oh, my life is good only because other people's lives aren't. And that sucks. Welcome to the mud. So no mud, no lotus. So no struggle, no realization. And if you're interested in Dharma practice, you are at the same time interested in struggling. And some of you aren't interested in struggling. A lot of Dharma people aren't. I was just telling Lama Matt this today about some of my students, where people look at me and they're like, oh, it's been really easy getting here. You must have, as Beyonce says, woke up like this. Granted, in my mind, that's the narrative I'm often playing. I just woke up like this. I just got up. I was like, oh. But that actually wasn't the case. I entered into the practice with a lot of struggle. A lot of my own suffering and having to confront that in a real way, not in a way that felt good and that felt romantic, like a rom-com, right? It didn't feel good like skipping through the forest, and down the lane, holding hands with my suffering and saying, oh, this is wonderful, no shit, no lotus. It wasn't really like that. It was more like, no, this is like horrible. Like, I can't believe, who's in charge, and don't they know who I am? Unfortunately, it just doesn't work out like that. It's not like walking into some space and we're like the head of the space. We're like, we have this authority. It's not how our lives are. It's not how our practice are. We're actually all starting in the same place, in this bit of ignorance, and there's no one to blame, unfortunately. In a way that's really wonderful, because what I was looking for early in my Dharma practice was agency. Now, I didn't know that until I got further into the practice, but the first teaching that I really got and understood in Buddhism was that there's suffering, there's discomfort, there's this dukkha. Dukkha means really, in the Pali terms, it's more like trying to put a lid on a Tupperware, but that lid doesn't fit. But you think it fits, and so you put it in the refrigerator, full of something like really like messy, like, I don't know, tomato sauce, and then you just stuff it in the fridge. And then, the next day you go, you open the fridge, and that Tupperware just comes tumbling out, and that lid just like pops off, and all that red sauce is all over the place. That's samsara. So samsara is thinking that things fit, thinking that things are just really put together, and then deluding ourselves, and then just putting it to the side and saying, okay, nothing's going to happen, and then something happens, and you're like, oh, this happened because this stuff doesn't ever fit to begin with. So I'm like making it up as I go along. I'm deluding myself, and that's how we perpetuate samsara and suffering. So that was the first teaching, really, that I got, that like there's suffering. there's this aggression that I'm trying to engage in, where I'm like, oh, I need everything to fit. I need everything to work out. I need everything to be, what's the word I'm looking for? Oh, permanent. And constant and never changing. And if you're really into permanence, then I would find another path to pursue, because this is a very unforgiving path, the path of Dharma, in terms of permanence. Nothing stays the same. Does anyone read Octavia Butler? Who reads Octavia Butler? Yeah. So the talents, the parable of the talents, the parable of the sower. So if you're interested in what's happening in the world right now, she's a really good writer to read. She's passed away. I always equate Octavia Butler and Audre Lorde together, which are two writers I'll be perpetually quoting for the rest of the weekend as we get into anger. And also I'll probably quote the Buddha somewhere. I know probably maybe one of these guys on the picture here. We'll see. We'll get there. But in Octavia Butler, in the parable of the sower and the parable of the talents, they're sequels, or they're two parts of the same story. And she speaks about this kind of the world is falling apart, just like what's happening now. Exactly, it's the end of capitalism, which is happening right now. It's just strange, just like prophecy. At the end of capitalism. In the book, she just talks about this world, America, which is eerily just like what we're experiencing. And she wrote these books in the 80s and 90s. And there's a right-wing, unstable president who has this really interesting slogan, which is "Make America Great Again." So I was thinking, God, did someone read that book and then come up with this campaign slogan? Because that's been around. Like Octavia Butler wrote that 20, 30 years ago. But, everything is just falling apart. Poverty, slavery is being institutionalized. Cities are falling apart. But the central character is a young Black woman who has this new spiritual path called Earthseed. And the central tenet of Earthseed is that God is change. And I was like, whoa, that's really profound. I was like, that's really similar to Buddhism. And I'm sure that, Octavia Butler took some influence from Buddhism, but this idea that when you enter into a relationship with the divine, you're entering into a relationship with perpetual change all the time. So if you want to be a spiritual person, then you're also interested in being adaptive and changing and evolving. And I just felt like that was such a beautiful kind of confirmation for me, that the world is falling apart, that everything is happening, but it's supposed to be falling apart. It's supposed to be happening. Like structures and systems and ideas and beliefs are supposed to be falling away, because that's what this path is all about, impermanence and change. And so the trauma that I experience is my inability to adapt, to meet that change face on, because I really want to be permanent. Because when I want to be permanent, I'm actually trying to center comfort in my life, and I'm just, so we get to this point where we're just like, I'm just really tired, and I want something to remain the same, because I'm tired of struggling, I'm tired of striving, I'm tired of always having to think differently and do things differently. Why can't everything remain the same? Because that's a lie, that's an illusion, So to enter into a relationship with an authentic practice means we're entering into a relationship with the fact that everything is always in flux. That's a very hard teaching, but I appreciate that teaching. That it goes back all the way to the first noble truth, or the truth of the noble ones. That there is suffering in life. It's not that life is suffering. I don't experience life as suffering, but I definitely experience suffering within living. There's an experience of suffering. And that experience of suffering is really important for me to articulate, because it's not, life isn't suffering, but there are experiences of suffering, and that it is natural. This is supposed to happen. That's so incredibly important to keep in mind. But this whole falling apart, right now, I really see this period as the apocalypse. Which is really wonderful. This is an old church, so this is appropriate. I speak sometimes, not all the time, but I often do really big public talks in churches. They're being repurposed by the Buddhists, often. It's either a Dharma center or a condo. So, that's where organized religion is heading. So I like to talk about my understanding, my relationship to the apocalypse. And apocalypse is a theological term. Apocalypse doesn't mean the end of the world. If it did mean if it did mean the end of the world, it would be just easy. It would be too easy. And if it's easy, it's not dharmic. But instead, apocalypse means just the lifting of the veil. The lifting of the mask. You're lifting the shades, and you're seeing the world now as it really is. You're seeing the truth of everything, and that can be heartbreaking. It could be heartbreaking for that dream, that vision of what you think life is, to kind of dissolve, and you're like, oh, this is the world. And I think that the 2016 elections was really a wake-up call for many of us. It was a huge veil dropping for many of us. You're like, oh, wait. This is not what I thought it was. And there's a shock, there's a trauma, and then you have a choice. How do I begin to metabolize this trauma now? I see the truth. I see part of the truth. But definitely, I'm not living in the past any longer. The past is past. Now I'm in this post-past reality. How do I begin to develop a relationship? Because what the source of my suffering actually has been is my rooting in something that has been impermanent. And things have been slipping and sliding along, and I've just kind of ignored it. I've willfully ignored it. And then I had to deal with the reality that things have always been changing, but I haven't changed. Because we don't have to change. We can firmly settle in something really intensely, and then the world around us changes. We call that fundamentalism. Fundamentalism means that the world can change, but I'm not. I need something to hang on to. In other words, when people say that, what they're saying is that the ego needs something to relate to, something that seems stable and permanent, because the ego can't be reminded that it's always in flux. It's just this loosely held together kind of gluttonous ball of perceptions and feelings and sensations, and we say, oh, that must be something there, we'll just call it I. It's like a big greasy ball. It's like when you clean out the grease trap. For those of us who've done food service, you have to clean out the grease trap. You're like, what is this shit? So that's the ego. The ego is always looking for a stable ground. And that will always definitely be a source of our suffering, when we're always trying to seek and prefer the stability. When in fact, the practice is to start making a home in instability. And when you do that work, you're going to look really messy. And unstable. People are going to be doing interventions for you. They're just going to be like, listen, Gene, They're going to be like, you seem like really off. What's wrong with you? We could rely on you, but now you just seem like a mess. What's going on? And what's happening if you're practicing authentically, what you're doing is engaging with the fluctuation of life. You're trying to develop a relationship to something that's always changing in a world that's desperately and aggressively trying not to change. So you're going to be actually enter into a counter-cultural, counter-relationship thing with reality, or with everyone around you, really. And you make people uncomfortable, too, when you're engaging and trying to develop a relationship with change. People need you to remain stable. They need you to remain the same old Fanny, right? The same old Sergio, right? Same old Gabby. And then you have to let people know, well, actually the person you thought I was, I'm actually always changing. I'm always evolving. The person I used to be 10 years ago, 15 years ago, particularly before my Dharma practice, I don't know who that person is anymore, but people still think I'm that person, which is disappointing. It's not disappointing for me. It's disappointing for all those people who want me to return back to the Rod I was 15 years ago. And it's just not what I need any longer, because I don't even know who that person is. I've evolved. I've changed. What has been so exciting about entering into the Dharma path is that it's the ways in which I'm encouraged to be messy, the ways in which I'm encouraged to let go, the ways in which I'm encouraged and taught that I can reconcile, I can heal, I can let go of the person that I used to be, and I can lean forward into something else, into a more liberated future. That's so incredibly important for us to start believing in. Liberation is something that I think we lose faith in. We don't know how to be free anymore. And it's all tricky. I know that you hear all this and you're like, well, why don't we just go to the ultimate and just be there? Because you can't. That's not how this works. It's you have to go through the relative in order to emerge into the ultimate. You have to earn your right to be in the ultimate. You just can't claim your territory and stake it. It's not like colonizing something. You just don't land on liberated ground and say that, well, this is mine. And now it's it's not how this works. It's I have to go through the process of learning about the land, the territory. I have to become the territory. I have to become the land. Once I become it, I begin to experience what liberation is. You begin to let go of things that actually get in the way. You know how to do that over time. Not just bypassing everything, but moving into developing relationships, understanding what is conducive, what reduces harm, what reduces violence, what promotes wisdom, love, patience. Then wisdom, love, patience, the four Brahma Viharas, the four boundless qualities, where we chanted in these prayers just a few minutes ago, that those are the tools, those are the supplementary practices that get us into the enlightenment. We have to develop compassion and love and joy and equanimity. That has to be the center of our practice. Those qualities help us to enter into the spaciousness of mind. And these are all these things they're trying to do. They're trying to unlock the space of the mind. That spaciousness of mind is patient, is kind, is happy, is joyful. And then we begin to develop an experience of the ultimate. And that experience of the ultimate, when we go through the development of the Brahma Viharas, is really, it's such a less violent way of being in the world. I don't have to ignore things. I don't have to bypass things. I don't have to create lies and stories about how I'm happy when I'm not. I don't have to do that because I'm in my truth. I'm in the reality. And people know that. I don't have to tell people I'm like, we don't have to tell people that you're not like a misogynist or a racist, or transphobic. You don't have to, like some of us do. Like, well, I'm not that. I'm not a racist. If you're saying that, you probably are. So it's when we arrive, when we've earned our right in the ultimate, to be in the ultimate, to embody those teachings, then people will know. People will sense the reduction and the harm and the violence and the ways that we're judging and the ways that we're getting things wrong. They will sense that. They will be like, oh, I feel like you're seeing me. I feel like you're holding space for me. Like people will just sense it. People will feel it. You don't have to wear your shirts. We all love wearing our shirts. The Black Lives Matter and this and that. But you don't have to wear that. Once you have an actual experience of openness and freedom, and you hold space for people within that space of openness and freedom, you are liberating people because you're liberated. Like my teacher told me once, oh, I don't see race, and I'm led to believe that that was the case because I never experienced anything where I felt like he was seeing race, and I feel like I got special treatment or, negative treatment or whatever, it was like, oh, you just happen to be black, but you're still going to work. Did he see gender? Probably. Did he have unmet needs? Probably. I would say yes. And that's a whole other thing. There are always shadows. There are always shadows. Enlightenment doesn't mean a completely sunny day. Even a completely sunny day has shadows. That's how I understand enlightenment. The mind can be radiant and clear, but it casts shadows, particularly as it sits in the relative. We're just really, uninterested in the shadows because we get so distracted by the sunshine. But I think the shadows are as interesting as the sunshine. I think one's realization is as interesting as one's blind spots. There's so much, that we can, talk about. But, I really, it's so important, this weekend to explore this idea of liberation through anger. Or is it liberation through rage? What am I doing?
Love and rage.
Love and rage, correct. Love and rage, which is, I'm writing a book on that right now. Or rather, it's writing me, I'm not for sure. So this is, these teachings are a part of just this set of teachings that I've been developing for, I guess, a year, 2 years. And they kind of came about, well, particularly after the election, after 2016, the election. It will always be the election. 50 years from now, it would be like, it will still be the election. Hopefully it's not another election. Hopefully we can survive that. But after the election, and the months afterwards, particularly, I guess it was last year. So last year, beginning of last year, people will, as we all know, we were all alive last year. People were just really overwhelmed and angry and sad and pissed off and paranoid and traumatized. And so I would do these Dharma talks, right? And like the only questions would be like, how do I survive? Like, what do I do with the anger and the rage? I just want to kill someone, killing rage. Where do I channel that? What do I do with it? And I thought, people just really are deeply undereducated around the emotions. It's like, what do you mean? What do you do with it? You know? And yeah, someone who's been working with anger, in my own practice for years and years, someone who came into the practice pissed off, and who remains pissed off, but has experienced quite a bit of spaciousness and freedom from anger. I wanted to articulate my experience of anger and rage, that it wasn't so simple either. In a way, it is simple. But on the one hand, it's not so simple, too. So many of us coming up in Buddhist kind of circles like this, and this is why, I don't hang out with Buddhists, because it's like, it's so weird about stuff. I'm like, I ask myself, what world are you living in, And then people are like, but you're the leader of the Buddhists. In my friends' eyes, they're like, you're like the Buddhist. I'm like, no, don't do that. Well, I want to be much cooler than that. But, so in our communities, so we, of course, there are Buddhisms, right? There are all kinds of lineages and traditions and schools of Buddhism. And this is all these things are just like really contemporary labels that we place on everything. This is like all the ways in which, well, not all the time, but a lot of it is the ways in which Western academia has attempted to characterize and categorize. Like Buddhism, Buddhism is much more abstract and open and spacious than how we attempt to neatly put it into categories. But when we talk about early Buddhism, we usually talk about Theravada, but it's not really that. Theravada is just like one strand of Buddhism that survived in early teachings of the Buddha. But when we say early Buddhism, it's really kind of pre-Theravada, perhaps. But in those teachings, when we say with sutras, in the early periods of the sutras and development of the sutras, anger really doesn't get a good rap. And that's really has influenced the development of other schools and lineages within Buddhism. So, anger is something that's taught in sutras, in the early sutras, it's something that's to be avoided. It's something that's wrong. It's something that gets us into trouble. And I'm not saying that isn't the case. It does get us into trouble, but it's actually not a mature relationship to anger, or any inflictive emotion, any strong, uncomfortable emotion, And so I am more influenced by later teachings around anger, particularly in the Vajrayana schools, the tantric, the roots of Vajrayana, where we're looking at how to transform anger. So when you talk about transforming anger, it means that you're actually not trying to avoid it. So transformation implies that you're trying to get curious and trying to move into relationship with anger. And that can be a really hard kind of, it can be really hard work, because particularly if you're taught to avoid anger, or if you feel as if you have, I would say, compromised agency around anger, I'd say enslaved by anger, But when we start moving closer to looking at anger, we begin to see that it's energy and thoughts and perceptions, sensations. We begin to look at the nature of an emotion. Emotion is just simply a sensation that we label. This embodied experience. And this is the current research. The research about emotions is always changing. Lama Rinpoche, my root teacher, who just recently passed this year, spoke about emotions as energy that's labeled in the mind, energy that is labeled by a thought, which is really beautiful, But when we started looking at like mindfulness studies and neurology and brain studies, they're kind of looking at how emotions arise as physical sensations, and those physical sensations are given a label of thoughts. And it's usually within the spectrum of good, bad, and the middle being neutral. So it's kind of three ways we can like label our relationship to anything really. Does it feel good? Does it feel bad? Is it neutral? So my work around anger really was initially just saying, okay, what is it about anger that people are really struggling with? And early on, this is something that has always been, from the very beginning, these were the teachings that I was given, was that our anger is the bodyguard for our woundedness, our hurt. And for me, it was so important to kind of boil it down to that. It gave me a perspective to start getting into this. It made me more interested in anger. Anger just wasn't this random thing. It wasn't just a reaction to something that I didn't like. It wasn't just the manifestation of aversion, as we're always taught. It wasn't, particularly in the early sutras, it wasn't just, a reaction to something that I cared about being challenged or being threatened. It was much deeper than that. It was the experience of being hurt and actually not being able to take care of that hurt. How the anger is actually arising to point us back to the hurt. When we say I'm pissed off, what you're actually trying to communicate is that I'm just hurt. And what is your quality of hurt? What is your quality of woundedness? What is that quality? For some of us it's fear, or some of us is sadness, some of us is, we call it woundedness or trauma, loneliness sometimes. What is that suffering beneath the anger? And then we get lost perhaps in the arising of the energy of anger, which is kind of this tension. Anger is this energy of tension that is actually our kind of the ways in which we're moving away from our pain. And within that space between our pain and our moving away is the tension that arises. Within that tension is actually trying to get us to pay attention to the woundedness. But that tension gets, mislabeled as anger. And we want to get out of that. So we try to respond to it. As we say, we have a compulsory relationship to that tension. And it becomes channeled. So we begin to direct that energy towards something that we've identified as hurting us, as called being the cause of that anger, like Donald Trump, or someone who cut me off on the road, or whomever, or my mother. Not that any of you are angry at your mother. It can be a wide range of things. It can even be yourself. And then when you start getting into that, these kind of basic understandings of anger, then you start having to, talk about suffering. What is suffering? What is pain? What is discomfort? What is trauma? What is woundedness? What do you mean by pain and suffering? What's the relationship of compassion and love in all of this? And how do I take care of myself? So I talk about love as being kind of an antidote. Traditionally we say patience is the antidote to anger, but I needed something else. It's not that those teachings are wrong, it just wasn't working for me. So yeah, we can just kind of sit tight and let it pass, but that has nothing to do with taking care of my hurt, and so love enters, actually love and compassion enter into my practice, where I'm saying, I want there to be freedom, liberation in my experience. And that's what love is. Love is freedom. Love is liberation. Whatever we love, we are wanting to be free. We wanted the thing, the object of our love, to be free. That's what love is. It's not about, again, skipping down the road, holding hands and singing Disney songs, or whatever really great rock ballad, love ballad that you love. It's definitely not that. These songs are nothing but suffering. But with really catchy tunes, though, Like Total Eclipse of the Heart is like one of my favorite songs. It's nothing but a song of suffering. Like, why would anyone ever fall in love after listening to that song? If you go away, I'm going to die. No, thank you. No, thank you. No, sir. But that's how many of us are educated concerning love. It's like, oh, this is like this really intense thing, this really intense attachment, and falling in love is great. Falling in love is wonderful. Like, I think it's really beautiful, but we have to fall in love and remember ourselves and remember our agency and remember freedom, and we also have to fall in love knowing that there's risk. We fall in love, we're like, oh, I'm not going to get hurt with this. Of course you're going to get hurt. And there's nothing undharmic about that. There's something that's really beautiful about that when you're risking that hurt. When you're risking disappointment, but you have to know that's what's happening. That when you fall in love, you get married. And you get married and you have, your dream partner, but someone will die if it's not divorce. Death will always come. And how do you live in a really loving way with that kind of understanding that things are always changing? Again, getting back to impermanence, things will change. How can I love with spaciousness and openness, but also love to also make sure that I get the things that I need, particularly from a romantic relationship, from a partnership. I don't want to lose myself. Like, we always want to remember who we are, and that's the thing. We don't want to avoid our suffering. We don't want to avoid our discomfort. And that's what some of us do. We fall in love, and it's like everything's perfect. So when we talk about this dharmic understanding of love, and I'm talking about like this really just like classic, straightforward love, which is the wish for others to be happy, and the wish for yourself to be happy. But it's not just about people, it's about things. So I can love something. When I love something, I'm actually giving it the space to be free. So when I'm talking about love and anger, what I'm actually talking about is learning how to love my anger in order to help it to be free, helping that energy to be free. How to love my suffering and letting that suffering be free. It doesn't go away, but you begin to offer it space. Give it space. Let it be there, which sucks. Everyone's always like, what's the shortcut? It's like the children's story, the bear hunt. You can't go over it, you can't go under it, you can't go around it. The bear hunt is, kind of an old story. But it's the same thing. It's like you can't go around your suffering, you can't go under it, you can't go over it. But you know what? You can go through it. And it's not the funnest thing ever. It's actually just going to be really crappy. But that's the path of liberation. We go through it. And once we start going through it, you're like, you see it, you're like, well, this isn't exactly what I thought it was. This is really complex. My anger is actually a whole bunch of stuff. My suffering is a whole bunch of stuff. But I can love this. And in loving it, I give it space. I want it to be there, even though it sucks. Because it's mine, it's there. When I experience a lot of pain and frustration, which is just daily, this is like happening every day, I say, but this is mine. This is in my experience, it's rising in my experience. I have to take responsibility for it. So now I'm going back all the way back to the elections again, so people, just really got really triggered, just really pissed off, and a lot of us have never had to struggle with that level of emotion before, And as meditators, Dharma practitioners, however you prefer to be identified, this is nothing but a basic practice of holding space, looking very deeply, And we know what to do. If you've been practicing for a bit, you know what to do, but you have to be reminded. And there's so many skillful things that we can do to support our practice. But the basic practice is holding space. And you hold enough space, and all of a sudden that anger reveals itself as this experience of energy. That's when you start getting into the Vajrayana tantric traditions of anger, and you start thinking about wrath and or tantric anger. And tantric anger and wrath are very similar. And it's really about the practice of decentering ego. When we decenter ego from anger, then it's just this energy that can be used to benefit others. Particularly when our ego is out the way, it's not about benefiting ourselves, it actually becomes about benefiting others. But when we channel that energy and move that energy, we're learning how to benefit ourselves because we're moving it. We're using that energy for something that's good instead of just sitting it in our experience and then falling into the trap of reacting to it over and over again, kicking someone's ass when it arises. So wrathful compassion or wrath or tantric anger is just an expression of direct compassion. That compassion is fueled by what was once the experience of anger, now the energy of anger. And that energy of anger is the energy of clarity. It's very, in terms of like Tantra, it's very Vajra. Vajra is this kind of discerning, cutting kind of wisdom. It's very straightforward. It's very clear. Like that energy, clears up everything really well, very quickly. Partially because the ego is out the way. That energy isn't circling around the ego. The ego has been decentered. And one's experience, what that could feel like or what that could look like is this, the ways in which, we can connect to this kind of like rumbling of anger in our experience. And then we begin to say, I wonder if I go through this process of working with anger, I wonder how I can decenter my ego. And so an example of this is, we'll practice more of this tomorrow during the day. But, so how do I start saying, okay, I am angry? Okay, that's easy. We say that all the time, I am angry. And then how do I evolve into saying, I am experiencing anger? How does that change our relationship to anger? And then we can keep going. We can say, instead of saying I am angry or there is an experience of anger, how about I say anger is happening? There's anger happening. And then it helps us to decenter the ego, and it helps us to take a good look around and say what's happening. Because my self-identification with anger actually limits my perception and my view. So it's hard for me to see actually what's going on. It's hard for me to notice what's happening. It's like, the horse blinders, those blinders you put on horses. If you've seen that, keeps them like just looking straight forward. It's how anger is. Anger is like it's very blinding. Our peripheral vision actually gets really narrow and straight, and we only see something that's in front of us, and we just say, maybe this thing in front of me is the reason why I'm experiencing this anger. Maybe I should attack them. But when we start decentering the ego, when I stop saying I am angry, but I am experiencing anger, and that there is an experience of anger, then those blinders get really wide. And I'm able to look around and say, what's really happening around me? And I'm able to see much clearer and say, there's something that's really happening around me that's a part of this triggering for me, but I don't want to get back. I don't want to create harm, but I need to disrupt whatever it is in my environment that's creating this disruption, or having a part, in this experience. So how can I just name it? How can I just neutralize it? That's when we get into wrath. So we have these wrathful deities, like we have here. Yeah, it's a Vajrapani. So you have these wrathful deities, Mahakala, Vajrapani, and these wrathful deities are the personification of this energy of wrath, which is to say that they're a personification of really direct, intense compassion. We talk about the Mahakalas, for instance, which are derived from Chenrezig. And Chenrezig is the bodhisattva of compassion, who, in his ontological story, was so upset with the world that he wasn't having an impact in it, that he just fell apart. As one would say, he had a fit. And I think it was Amitabha who came along and put him back together. And it was like, you need to get it together. Like you just have to adapt. You have to do something different. And so that's when he began to emanate the Mahakalas, the protectors. And the Mahakalas were like the intensified, distilled version of compassion, of his essence. And they worked so swiftly in a way that he couldn't. That's wrath. And you see these pictures of monsters and demons surrounded by fire and blood and tools and implements and so forth. And people look at it and are like, oh, this is nothing but Satan. But the wrathful deities are simply reflections of our own energy. They're often just reflections of the ways in which we have yet to develop agency over the potency of our anger. And so they're codes. So these deities, these tankas, this iconography, they're just really, they're coded images. And these codes help us to break through into our own emotions, to start channeling our own emotions, particularly wrath and anger and compassion. There's not pretty pictures of demons and whatever. They're actually saying, oh, this is you. On one hand, they're saying, oh, this is you when you're just really out of control and ugly and lost in your anger. And then on the other hand, they're like, and this is the reflection of your power. So you're this powerful, if you could just channel that as well. But we're really afraid of our power. We're afraid of our agency. We have such a complicated relationship with our own agency, and that intensifies anger. And that leads into rage. Rage meaning that there's a loss of control, there's a loss of ego. When anger just completely annihilates the ego, then you're lost in this rage. And when people are in rage, they're quite dangerous. They're not grounded. They're not, they're not in tune with anything. With rage, our experience is I am rage. And the boundaries are just evaporated. The world becomes the cause of my rage. Everything. Which gives away, which helps us understand a lot of the shootings, the mass shootings that we've been experiencing. That rage, is irrational. But this practice of wrath and tantric anger, it's not something that, if you're new to the practice, you're not necessarily doing that. It takes years of practice. It takes years of developing a relationship to anger for us to get to the point where we're able to use anger skillfully, not to hurt other people, but to free people. Some of us think, I'm freeing people by being angry. I'm really angry, and that, for instance, like, we say, oh, my anger makes me a good activist. It actually doesn't. It makes you a pain in the ass for me. I'm not saying that anger isn't important. Anger is important, but it's actually the love that's transformative. It's the love, actually, that disrupts systems of violence and abuse. The anger, the energy is there. It can propel us, but anger isn't guiding you to benefit everyone involved in a situation. We don't disrupt systems of violence and systems of patriarchy and misogyny and phobias, and we don't disrupt those systems just by being really angry and just running out there and just hurting. And it's not what we do. We disrupt systems of violence through love. Love is the antidote. But love doesn't mean it's passive either. Again, these wrathful deities also embody love. They're the embodiment of compassion and love, but just in such an intense form that it hurts. The ego is so removed that it's nothing but benefiting. It's nothing but clarity. It's nothing but wisdom. And many of us aren't ready for that. For that practice. Because that practice also is about risking. It's about giving up something. What are you willing to risk? And this is what Lama, Matt, and I were talking about today, is the risk. What are you willing to give up to be free? What are you willing to give up to see systems of dominance and power and violence disrupted? Like, your anger isn't enough. Your anger isn't like this moral, ethical thing. Who cares? Everyone's angry. But what are you doing? What are you risking? Are you still trying to privilege comfort and the work of getting free and disrupting violence? You're not necessarily going to have both. And we talk about getting free. We talk about basic Dharma practice. It's the same thing. What are you willing to give up? Are you willing to die to get free? And it's okay if you say no, of course. It doesn't make you a bad practitioner. Of course not. But I'm just saying that, something has to be offered. We have to decide what it is we're going to offer. And that's where people and their relationships with ultimate teachings, that's where the bullshit hits the fan. Well, if everything's empty, you can just give your life for something. Because it doesn't matter, does it? Because it's empty. Are you willing to do that? Are you willing to put your body on the line to protect people? What are you ready for? Are you just using ultimate teaching just to feel comfortable and to look like a good practitioner? You're not going to look good in front of me, but I'm sure it does for someone who's not read anything about Buddhism. And you're like, oh, that's wonderful. Ultimate, oh yeah, everything's a dream. That's great. If everything's a dream, your body's a dream. So head to the front lines and see what happens. If you're really invested in the ultimate teachings, then there's nothing holding you back. Absolutely nothing holding you. Get it. So you go there. You're on the front lines. You're doing the work. So this all seems like really hard for people, and I get it. I've been there. I totally have been at the beginning of my practice where my teachers were like, "Okay, your mind and thoughts." I'm like, "Oh, I don't get this." And anger and sex and lust, all of that. This is so impossible. How does anyone deal with this? I am so controlled by this stuff. My mind, I'm just enslaved to the thoughts and the energy and the emotions. I'll never get free. Then, I realized that I had to put the work in. I had to do something that, we get really tired of hearing about. I'm just going to reiterate it and say that you have to sit. And you get tired of sitting, you continue sitting. You know, there has to be a period where you're just sitting. You know, sitting is just a metaphor. It doesn't mean you're actually sitting on a cushion or a chair. You know, it means that like you're practicing, you're watching your mind. You're always going back to, you're always watching, you're always returning, you're always looking at thoughts, you're always feeling things, you're always embracing, you're always holding space. Over and over and over again. That is the heart of how we practice freedom on this path. It's through awareness, the cultivation, first of mindfulness, concentration and mindfulness, then we move into open awareness practices. You go along the continuum because you're trying to see things, you're trying to understand, you're trying to like not react in the ways that you do, because that reaction spins the wheel of samsara. You know, it's our reactivity, it's our compulsory relationship to the things in our minds that spin this wheel of samsara out of control. It's our compulsory relationship to anger that feeds the anger, that makes us a slave to that energy. So we say, oh, you know, I don't believe that. Well, you know, when I work with young practitioners, I say, well, I mean, of course you don't believe it, you don't practice. And if you're not going to practice that, I don't have any more time to spend with you either. You know, I'm just not interested. I'm not interested in just like being your cheerleader. I'm so sorry. There are other teachers who could do that. You know, they're a lot cheaper than I am. I mean, not that I do this for money, but you do get a bill. It doesn't always have to do with money though. But there's a bill. There's always a cost. You know, there's always a cost. It may not be money, it's something. You know, and then what did I have to give up? Well, I gave up a lot. I gave up, you know, when I started this path, it was like, I'm going to die doing this, basically. I went to a retreat, I was like, if I have to die in this retreat, I will. You know, even when like I got really hurt in the retreat and had to like go to the emergency room, I was like, I'm not going anywhere. You know, and I didn't. I was like bleeding everywhere. I was like, this is so ridiculous. Like, what kind of medieval thing is this? Where I can't even go to the emergency room. You know, but I was creating it. Like, no one was forcing me to do anything. And I realized, oh, this is me and effort and diligence awakening. It's like, oh, even if I like have the threat of dying, I'm not going to go anywhere. You know, and I was like, oh, that's what it means to live in the ultimate teachings. You know, and the development of faith in our practice and ourselves is, you know, important. You know, we can develop faith by just not giving ourselves choices. As my teacher used to say, you know, Lama Rinpoche used to say, well, no choice. You know, no choice. And then when you would make a big deal about something, he would be like, you're so stupid. Like, get over it. Because I hear that voice all the time. It's like, it's no choice, just do it. You know, what am I going to do? Oh, no choice. You know what to do. You just don't want to do it. You're lazy. But, you know, we're getting close, you know, in time. I want to have some space for any questions that you may have. And tomorrow we're going to do much more practice. You want to use the mic, Fanny? Well, can someone bring it to her? She's handicapped.
I don't think I have a choice.
No choice. She's not getting up.
She's saying that so much, like no choice.
As far as it goes.
I'll get closer. So one of the things they were bringing up. I'm scooting.
There you go.
I'm scooting.
Right.
Okay. So, aren't we conceptualizing anger when it's rising in us? I get that when we're experiencing the energy and the emotion of something that we have chosen to call anger, because it's restrictive and it's, I guess it manifests. For me, I get hot.
Yeah.
I get like, my throat closes. Like now I'm having like burn in here, like heartburn. So I can't remember what practice I was exposed to that spoke about, instead of concretizing and labeling it, to stay with what manifests, and somehow that has a dissolution as well.
Yeah. Well, it's using those physical sensations as anchors in meditation. So you just bring your mind to like, okay, my throat is tightening. I feel that heat. And you're just like getting really curious about that. And that helps to disrupt the labeling of it. And that disruption of the labeling actually disrupts our reactivity.
Yeah.
But the energy is going to be there. But you're grounding yourself so you don't get caught up in the reactionary thing there.
Thanks. And you said something about that anger is the agency.
Agency.
But not the. Did somebody else get that?
What was that? The anger.
Oh. I thought I project well. When you were describing the different ways that anger manifests, and you said it's not something agency. I know you were using agency a lot, but did anybody get that?
Yeah.
What was that? What was that term? And I didn't quite understand it.
What was what did I say?
Developing agency over the energy of the anger?
No, it was before that.
So sometimes we get really frustrated when we feel powerless, and that's a way that we compromise agency in the moments. Yeah. And a lot of us are pissed off just because we actually don't have a relationship to our agency. Like, we don't realize that we have a lot of power. The power, our relationship with that power may be a little bit diluted, like it may be ambiguous, right? You just don't know. And even that not knowing creates a lot of confusion for us. So it's the same thing about boundaries. Like, we get really intense about boundaries. A lot of people don't get boundaries because they don't get their agency. They don't actually believe that they can say no, that they can create conditions, that can reduce whatever they're experiencing in the moment. So then you fall into this illusion where I don't have any power. I don't have any way to deal with this situation. It can be quite frustrating. We have to move energy, we have to channel energy. It can get really stuck in our body, in our experience. And then you're just really resentful as well. Why does this person get to do what they want? Why are they making these choices? Well, to an extent, you can make those same choices. You ever talk to people, I don't know, they go through, they have a situation and you're like, I don't know, sitting with them, you're processing with them, and, you ask them, why didn't you just do X, Y, and Z? And sometimes we get really triggered by those questions. So like, well, you're blaming me. I was like, well, I'm not blaming you, but I'm just trying to help you understand that you have agency that you're not actually embracing. Sometimes the narrative of being powerless is really self-serving for us. Victimhood, and then we've all been victims of something. We've all survived something, of course, but at some point, this is what Dharma helped me to do, is actually help me to really understand that I have a lot of agency within working with my own mind. There can be systems of, for instance, racism. There can be those systems and individual experiences, systematic experiences. But those experiences don't define me. They don't have to define me. So I can live in a racist society, but I can still be happy. And again, I hear Rinpoche in my mind, and I hear him saying, well, no choice. And my happiness doesn't come at the expense of anyone. It's just my happiness, too. And it's a happiness that takes into account the ugliness of the world. The world is ugly, right? It's also really quite beautiful. It's all of that. Yeah. What else? Any other questions? Yeah. There's more where that came from. It'll cost you, though.
So you've used two terms that I'm really not sure what you mean by them, and one is holding space,
Yep.
and the other is agency.
Yep.
So as we've talked here about agency more, so is agency the same as power?
It's self-power.
Self-power?
Yeah, it's how I relate to my own power. Like what can I do and what can I not do? What are my rights? What are the choices that I can make and I'm not making? So my agency, for me particularly, my self-agency is how I'm using my power in the world. Like what are the choices that I'm making? What choices can I make? Am I determining as much as I can the conditions, the qualities of my experiences? And Dharma is all about self-agency because all the responsibility is thrown back on us. It's our work to watch our minds. It's our work to develop compassion and love and equanimity and kindness. No one's going to give that to us. The teachers give us the teachings, but that's not the same as them doing the work for us. My teachers didn't do the work for me. They helped create the conditions for me to do my work with as little obstacles as possible. But it's me doing my own work, and that's the expression of agency. I have the agency to practice Dharma, and thus I have the agency to get free. The holding space is also an expression of agency. So holding space is simply allowing everything to be there. So when I watch my mind, it's how I let both the pleasant and the unpleasant experiences be there. And then when I'm actually in interactions with folks, when I'm holding space for people, it means that I allow that person to be there without reacting to them in a way that may disrupt their vulnerability. So it's like when someone comes to us with something that's really vulnerable, it's how we're able to get really wide and open and just be there and holding space. So holding space is it kind of doesn't make sense, but holding space simply means that I'm allowing everything to be in my experience. I'm allowing everything to be in your experience as you're sharing it.
Okay, thank you.
It's going to be in the book, too, whenever I get around to writing that. It's kind of due soon. We'll see. But I have a chapter on holding space, because a lot of people don't know what it means.
Well, I'll read that.
Yeah. It's going to be like a step-by-step thing, so I feel like it could be really useful, in our communities. Agency is also about confidence. Too, it's confidence in myself, confidence in my practice. It's saying that I'm not just a victim walking through the world. Which is easy for some of us. It's really easy for us to fall into a narrative of saying, I'm always being attacked, I'm always being marginalized. And that may actually be the case, but I don't have to buy into that. I can be in this really, this emerging fascist and nationalist country, but I'm not be a victim. personally, I choose not to be a victim. People's racism and fascism is really often about fear, and other people's fear is an unfounded fear. Like just like fear because I'm black or whatever. It has nothing to do with me. If you're afraid of me because I've done something, that's completely different. This is kind of a skillful fear where you're protecting yourself, of course. But when you're just afraid of people just because they're just being themselves, particularly if they're not being violent, when you're afraid of like a caravan of people coming to the United States, for no reason, that's really like, that's what we're talking about. It's like you're just afraid of something that actually has done nothing to you and will not do anything to you. That's not my particular responsibility. Particularly if it's because you're a racist and you have a problem with me, that's not my problem. Actually, your racism isn't my problem. It creates problems. It creates systematic problems for me, of course, but it's not my suffering. That doesn't have to be my suffering. Obstacles aren't suffering. But it can definitely turn into an obstacle. Racism is an obstacle, and it has been a source of suffering. It still is a source of suffering, but it's way less suffering for me, since I've been practicing. I'm able to see, agency helps us to see whose work is it, whose issue it really is. It's like what's my work? Am I doing other people's work for them? Like, my work isn't to undo white supremacy. It may seem like I'm doing it. I'm actually not. However, my work is to undo patriarchy. Do you get that? You undo what you're benefiting from. The people who aren't benefiting from it's not their job to undo it. They have nothing to do with it. So that can really help us, having a sense of agency, having a sense of the work that we're supposed to be doing actually helps us to have a better sense of care and self-preservation in the world. So, one last question before we end tonight. It'll be quick answer.
But don't. Whoops, sorry.
Oh.
But don't people that have that fear, like of the caravan, which we know that's not a real fear, don't they just choose their own fear?
Yeah.
They choose to have that fear.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Ultimately, everything's a choice. I'm choosing to be here in samsara. I may not get that, but that's the thing about Dharma is that, like, I'm actually making a choice when I think I'm not, and then the struggle is, how do I actually understand that I'm actually just making a choice, that I'm not forced to do this? That I'm just not naturally doing this, and that's what we're trying, that's the work I think we're trying to do now, is to help people understand that, like, your fear is actually making a choice for you. If you can, like, love your fear and hold space for your fear, that fear actually becomes less impactful for you, less powerful, just like anger. We're habitually responding to our fear, we're habitually responding to our anger in ways that we're not even thinking about. So early on in my practice, it was definitely, particularly with anger, I was like, there's no way that I cannot respond to my anger. That's what I believed. And then just sitting over and over again, it actually helped me to understand I was making choices. It just happened so quickly. Anger arises, I'm cussing someone out, I'm kicking someone's ass. But for me, anger always manifested as passive aggressiveness. So I was always just passive aggressive. I was like, well, this is who I am. I can't change that, but I can. I am making a choice because I'm repressing anger in a way that is coming out in really indirect ways. And the same with fear. I am being controlled by my fear until I learn to look at the fear. But within this country, within the world, but like just limiting it to like this country, we have a lot of unprocessed, undiagnosed, unmetabolized trauma. That I don't know what we're going to do about. And it's popping out, it's bursting. That's why we have so much gun violence. Right now, it's just an easy outlet. But you're going to see more of that. That's why we have to shift to reconciliation in this country. But I don't know if that's going to ever happen. But regardless, what is our work to do? What are we called to do right now? Tell people, help people sit with their fear, their hate, their anger, their loneliness, their sadness. Everything that you thought was real, everything you thought was really important isn't. That's devastating. I get that. But how can we help each other? How can we help other people create a different way of being together, a different vision of what community is? How can we create different identities that aren't based upon, domination of other people? So that's it for me. That's all of my propaganda.